for better or worse, the line between, work and, leisure is hard to define for me in a way because I've been able to work on so many projects that are about things that I love. So, a lot of projects I feel like, oh, I've been working on this project since I was 12, you know. It's like a lot of music projects. I did this Keith Richards documentary, and the first day of shooting, I brought 100 albums to his house with a turntable, and we just sat there for 3 hours and played records
Wow.
and talked about them. And I was like, I just want to see as a starting place for our relationship and for this film, like what happens with that.
Mhm.
And it was so great. And Keith was like, can we just keep doing this? Like, this is so much fun. And when Keith left, I said, I think I've been preparing for that interview for 30 years. Like
Nice.
in a lifetime of listening to music and being obsessed with music. And you want to talk about, Hank Ballard or Hank Williams, or you want to talk about, Muddy Waters, who I did a film about, or, James Cotton or anybody. It's like
Mhm.
you kind of, if you feed off of your own passion, I mean, that's kind of the theme of all this is like, I respond to passion. I'm passionate about things. When people
Yeah.
are passionate as collaborators, then kind of we'll figure it out together.
Yeah, that's great. And when it comes to, I'm curious to hear more about your pre-production process. Could you talk a little about like your creative process as far as creating the Pinterest boards and the music, the playlist and everything, and just saying like, hey, look at this, and here's the vibe that I'm looking for. But could you describe more in detail about your pre-production process?
Well, because my process tends to be less defined by pre-production, production, post-production. It's more like, so with somebody like Pharrell or like most of these interviews, if I'm working with like a living subject, say, I always start with audio interviews, kind of right away. So, often I'll just take a tape recorder, like a Zoom recorder, the two of us, and we'll just talk and I'll record and then, and it helps me see, it does a number of things. One, without spending a lot of money, it allows me to build my relationship with them, allows me to see how they speak, how they tell stories, allows me to see how they see their own story and what perspective they have on themselves. Um, and certain people are great storytellers of their own story, and certain people are not. And certain people have very little insight into themselves, So but you need to learn all that. So it's a way of like, I get so much out of those conversations of just trying to um, really understand them. I mean, yeah, I've done hours and hours and hours, and it's often I will like if they're somewhere else, like I did a show called Abstract for Netflix about art and design. And the first episode I directed with this German illustrator named Christoph Niemann. And it's one of my favorite things I've ever made. And because Christoph is such an original thinker. And he was in Berlin, and I hired a sound person to go to his house and set up a mic. And then I would talk to him for 2 hours. And I did that 4 times before we ever shot this episode. So I had 8 hours of him giving me his entire philosophy. And then when I started filming, I was like, well, he always talks about the sense of time, and he always talks about what he thinks about when he's drawing. And he just gave me all these ideas that became ways to film him. It's
Mhm.
like, okay, we're going to do a sense of a passage of time in a day that, I did one thing with him because he talked about the mind in his own head. So I filmed him working for an hour and a half. Then I cut that down to like a 30 minutes of selects of him working, just drawing. And then I put him in a room by himself with a microphone. And I said, watch yourself working. And I just want you to articulate the voice in your head. Like, I want you to speak to yourself, watching yourself work alone. And he did. And it was funny and unusual. And it was, but these kinds of like experiments that you need I feel like by doing these audio interviews, it gives you starts to give you a framework of how to film it and approach it in those ways. And in some cases, like this film, it was all audio. I mean, we did film certain interviews and certain scenes, but most of the film was audio only,
Mm.
and that is liberating in its own way. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I bet. And talking about interviews, you're such a master interviewer. It's just not an easy task to do, and especially when you're talking to people about their own lives. And with in Piece by Piece, Pharrell was so honest and so vulnerable. And you also make an appearance in that film,
Yeah,
showing
I normally I'm a
yeah,
minifig in this film. Normally, I'm not in my films. Yeah.
exactly. So could you tell us about um, how you prepare for those interviews? I know you talked about like the pre-interview process, but then where you actually got the cameras and everything, can you talk about what your approach is to getting that vulnerability on camera?
I mean, again, I said some of it before, but like I listen as hard as I can. So what I do is I have done a lot of research. I typically write up, pages of notes for questions. And then I write a page where I digest every question to a word. So, so I just have, so in my hand, I have a piece of paper with a bunch of words.
Hmm.
And each word is like, oh yeah, it's this question. And then once I've done that, I never look at it. I never ever look at notes when I've done an interview, you
Hmm.
know, like because I want to be there in the moment. If I don't get to everything, like that's not as important as like going with the conversation has a flow to it and you have to kind of honor it when it feels like it's getting heavy or getting light or reaching its end. It's like I don't force it. I'm like, okay, this is where it's going. But part of it is me just really being engaged with them and listening when they're saying, I was like, oh, what do you mean by that? Like it's fine, like interrupting them. And also it depends, but the way people speak often feeds off of your engagement and energy too. So I think a lot of it is just um, when people feel like they're really being heard, you
Hmm.
know, in that way, people like that. They're like, oh, this isn't just me telling you the anecdote that I always tell, about this. It's like, no, we're actually going to get into it in a way. And that's part of what I like about doing the audio too, is like, it's a chance for me to do a lot of that um, groundwork of like and I always use lots of bits of that audio, even if I'm shooting it with picture later, that audio always comes into use. Um, but yeah, just not being, I've seen people interview people almost like a hostile witness in a court, where isn't it true that your first album was, because you and your best friend, hated each other or whatever, um, that's the best way to get a terrible interview out of somebody.
Hmm.
It's like, and it's this question of like trying to ask questions you don't know the answer to. It's like, yes, there are probably things you need to get out of them that you probably do know what they're going to say. But it's really about trying to be surprised by them because if you're asking questions you don't know the answer, then they're probably hearing questions they don't typically answer, and and again, some of these are, famous people get interviewed. I interview lots and lots of people who don't get interviewed too, and that's it, but it's similar in a way, I mean, it was interesting on like film like 20 Feet from Stardom, I'd spent, that project, I didn't know what that story was going to be. Like I just knew this world was interesting and my producer was like, go investigate. So I did 50 oral histories before we started making that film, where I just talked to backup singers just about everything, just trying to like understand. And ultimately, I think I interviewed 80 backup singers. Um, and that out of that work came like, oh, here are the themes, and it's really the story about what it means to music, about the influence of Black churches into popular music, and about the, how the business treats, women of color and everything. But like none of that, I didn't know what any of that was going to be going in other than, oh, this is an interesting world. Like, let me try and figure it out. Um, but to my other point then, like they were great people to talk to and meet, but then interviewing famous people about backup singers, the great thing about that was they'd never been interviewed about backup singers. I interviewed like Mick Jagger and Bruce Springsteen and Sting and everybody. I don't think they had ever been asked a question about backup singers, So for them, it's something they've thought a lot about, you know.
Yeah.
How do you use them? What did they add? How does it work with your voice? What's the blend? What's the, all these, and they're like, oh,
Mhm.
like this is new. Like, this is something that I actually really have thought about and care about. And like, I always feel like that's such a rich vein when you could like tap into something that people are like, oh, you're really interested in this thing I care about that is kind of invisible typically, and I always love doing that.
Awesome. So I do want to get into piece by piece a little bit before we get into the questions. And um I want to know, what have you learned when making this film?
I mean, I learned everything about animation, not everything, but I went to school on animation. Uh, an animation, I've had, and like Won't You Be My Neighbor, we had animation. I've used animation in different projects, but real animation is the opposite of documentary. I mean, just from the mindset is the opposite of documentary because in animation, you have total control. It's like you are God. So in animation, you get to decide what the wallpaper looks like, how people move, what they say, like everything is controlled. And in documentary, you have so little control. You don't necessarily get the perfect focus or get to decide what the room looks like or get to even put the camera where you want it. There's so many compromises. And a big thing I came into when I started working with the animation team on that was I want to keep the grammar of documentary going into the animation. And they're like, but you're crazy. Like, what do you mean you intentionally want to have a shot out of focus? And I was like, because that's what happens. Like it was stuff they just like, it was really hard for them. And then finally they kind of like got it. Like, okay, fine, we give up. Like, we'll do it that way. So I learned a lot about that whole process. And it's, you know, every shot you go over again and again in micro detail, and it's just the kind of fine detail work. In documentary, so much of it you can kind of fix and post, or in the edit, and we're like, oh, in the editing we can kind of fix this, or we could do a pickup, whatever it is. In animation, it gets it solidifies almost instantly. It's very hard to go back in animation once something starts to set. It just gets really cumbersome and expensive and everything to go back and undo stuff.
Yeah.
So we actually had a whole cut of the film with drawings and movie clips and archive footage and stuff we had shot that we had kind of locked before we went to animation. And then we storyboarded the whole film from the beginning again and did it over. But I think the thing that got me most excited about it was just trying to figure out different gears of nonfiction storytelling, of because of animation, you can kind of time and space travel. So, if somebody was telling me a story about something, an important moment, I would really drill in and say, so tell me about that moment. So when they came into the room and you had this conversation, what did they say to you? And what did you say to them? And what was the room like? And, I really like tried to get them to take me to that moment as much as they could. And then in the film, I was able to kind of be in the room at that moment and have them talking to each other, in different situations. So it was really interesting for me to suddenly feel like, oh, this is, often in the creation of music, or the creation of anything, or, there's not necessarily a camera there filming, but by taking all the elements I had of the stems of a song where I hear somebody's isolated voice in a room speaking into a microphone, or I have the demo of them trying it out, and then I have them telling a story and somebody else telling a story about that moment, then suddenly with all these things, you can kind of be there in that
Mhm.
moment. And that to me was so exciting to feel
Yeah.
like, oh, I can finally be in the place I want to be of something that happened 10 years ago, just because with animation, it kind of gives me this whole other gear of storytelling, which just allows you to be more present in a way, and yes, you can be present in documentary, but in a way that just allowed you to be kind of jump and be present in all kinds of different ways. And the other thing that really felt liberating was, to my earlier point about Pharrell's is kind of imagination, that it allowed me to actually be inside his head way
Mhm.
more and to be subjective in terms of, both aesthetically and kind of narratively. And Pharrell is interesting because a person, he has synesthesia, which means he sees color when he hears sound. And
Mhm.
it just unlocked all these kind of possibilities of like, oh, we can see all this. And when he's making beats, the beats can be physical things, and we can kind of represent all this stuff almost more in someone's mind's eye as opposed to just their, what you can capture with the camera. So for me, that was just like an amazing, like new gear to be able to play with in storytelling.